Okay, for this next lesson, we're going to take what we learned in exponential functions and graphing them, and we're going to start to apply them to the actual equations to real-world scenarios. And if you remember, the initial equation for exponential functions that we learned was a times b to the x power. Now, we remember that this was an exponential growth function. And so for this particular section, we're going to be discussing exponential growth models. And so this new equation that we have right here is called a growth model. Now, you can see by looking at it, it has a lot of the similar parts to the exponential growth function that we dealt with in the previous lessons. But we're going to take this and we're going to apply it to some real-world scenarios. So it gives us some new parts that we have to learn. We have an A value, we have an R value, and we have a T value that we're going to have to deal with here. Now, the A value can represent our initial amount of whatever, and so that amount can be the number of internet sites that we deal with, the amount of money that we started off with. It can represent pretty much anything. Now, when we're talking about a growth model, what we're saying is that we're going to start with so much of a particular item, and then it's going to increase at a certain percentage rate. And so you can see here that the R is the actual percentage rate, and of course with any percentage rate, if you're going to use that percent in an actual equation, you actually have to move the decimal place back 2 spots so that it then is created as a decimal and can be used appropriately in the growth model. And then lastly, we have T. Now, T is the quantity in years. So this is an extremely important part, because if you give the time value in months, let's say, you're going to have to take those months and convert them into years. So you may end up with a decimal or fraction value. Let's say if they gave us 6 months, we would have to write that as 1/2 for the amount of years. So just be aware that you may have to convert months to years to be able to use this model correctly. Now, if we look at just the inside part of the equation, we have 1 plus R, and that's called the growth factor. Now, that's a very important term for you to know. What that's going to tell you is exactly what rate, what factor that your original amount is going to grow by. And so we'll discuss that quite a bit more in class from time to time. But as with any particular exponential growth function, what's generally missing in the value is the exponent. And so you're going to find that in many of these examples, we're actually looking to replace the T for time, and then once we find the T for time, we can solve for the Y, depending on what the Y actually represents. So let's take a look at sample problem number 3 here. And we will kind of break down all these parts. Now, you can go ahead and pause the video if you like and read through this and see if you can apply the exponential growth model above to the A, B, and C parts, and see if you can figure this out. So if you want to take that route, go ahead and pause the video now. Try to work out the problem on your own. And that way you can see how well you did, and you can correct it as you went along. If you're not sure what you're doing at this point, then you can just wait and go through it with me as I work it for you. Okay, so let's take a look. It says in January of 1993 there were about 1.3 million internet hosts. Now let's take this book and explain first of all this problem. Host is the same thing as websites. So it's an old term. When the internet first started up, websites were called internet host sites. So it's a little bit of a different terminology. I don't want you to be confused by that. Now, during the next 5 years, so from 1993 to 1998, the number of websites actually increased at 100% per year. So just to give you a little history, the internet was very, very new, and it was in its infancy. And so as people became more comfortable with what it actually was and what it actually did, internet sites actually began to pop up and grew at an exponential rate. And in this case, over that 5-year period, they grew at a rate of 100%. So it says to write a given model in the number h of hosts for t years after 1993. So if you remember, any model that we write should have 2 missing variables. So if you remember, if we write a model representing a line, y equals 2x plus 1, that's a model representing that particular line. We're missing the x, we're missing the y. So as we write this model, we're going to use the previous growth model as a guide to creating this model. Now, we're looking for the number of host sites, so we're going to be looking for h. And then, of course, we don't know, we want to write the model in relation to the number of years. So t years, which in this case our exponent will be our other missing variable. So we need to come up with 2 parts here. We need to know the initial amount that we started with, and we need to know the basic rate. So as we look at this, we were given that information. We had 1,313,000 initial host sites, and then our rate was 100%. But remember, we have to take that 100% and we have to rewrite it as a decimal. So I have to come backwards 2 spots, and that decimal is 1.0, or simply 1. And then we can raise that to the t power, because they want us to write this in terms of t. Now, I'm going to give myself some room over here. So that is a model with 2 variables that we're representing. However, wherever there's a place that we can consolidate, we need to go ahead and do that. So h can be represented by 1.3 million times 2 to the t power. And if you look at that, that kind of takes on the same form as y equals a times b to the x power. So it looks just like an exponential growth function that we dealt with in previous videos. So this particular equation would be the answer of write a model. So very important that you understand what a model looks like. Notice we have 2 variables in the model. Now, if we apply a t value, that's like for a t-chart, that's like determining an x value, we can come up with the h value, which is the number of internet host sites. So our next question simply asks, how many host sites were there in 1996? Well, we can determine that if we can figure out one thing. What is our t value? So we need to figure out our t. Now, if you recall up here, that our original starting value for the number of years was 1993, but I don't want to put 1996 in the time value, because remember, t represents the number of years since this model began. So I'm going to take 1996 and subtract 1993, which gives me t in 3 years. And so we're going to plug in 3. And now our h, if we put that into our calculator, is going to be 10,504,000 websites. So this is the number of websites that we had in 1996. So we went from 1.3 million in 1993, and by 1996 the internet was off and running, and we were up to 10.5 million internet websites. And so now we want to get a visual picture of what's happening with this growth rate. So we want to graph the model. So here is our original model. And if we wanted to graph this, what we're basically going to do is we're going to create a t-chart. Now, we're going to supply the t values so that we can come up with the h values. And let's take a look at this. Notice that we only gave you quadrant 1 of the graph. And the reason we did that is because we can't go back negative years. And we know that the exponential growth function is not going to dip below the x-axis, or what in this case is going to be the t-axis, because we can't have a negative number of years or a negative number of host sites since we're starting with 1.3 million. So if I were to plug 0 in here, I would know that I'm basically going to start with 1.3 million. So I'm just abbreviating that to consolidate space. Now, we already did 3 years back here in example B, so I'll take 3 years, and that came out to be about 10.5 million. And if I plugged in about 5 years for T, that's going to give me roughly 42 million. And you'd want to use your calculator to come up with all this. Now, here's where we get to the tricky part. If you remember working in word problems back in the first semester, when we were given a blank graph like this, we would have to create our own scale given the values in our t-chart. And so for years, I just need to start at 0 years and just simply create the best scale that I can for the years. Now, if you notice, if you look at the number of internet websites or host sites, we get way up into the millions very quickly. So it may be an easier thing to create these in terms of 5s or 10s. So we can try to make the niche marks the same spacing as the years, but then we're going to say increase by 5s, and that may not even be big enough because you can see that we're going to have to deal with 42 million. So our 42 million is going to be kind of up a little higher than that even, so we'll just have to guesstimate that. Or you could do it by 10s as well, and 10, 20, 30, 40, and that would be a little bit better picture of what we're dealing with here. So let's take a look. We're going to graph 0, 1.3 million, so that's going to be somewhere in here is a good guesstimate. Then we're going to go to 3 and 10.5, which is, again, a good guesstimate since we're not working on a really sharp graph. And then we're going to go to 5 years and 42 million. And, of course, you know, that's probably going to be up there somewhere. And so then I would just simply do the best I could to draw that exponential growth function. And so you can see that the internet websites took off astronomically in what we would call an exponential growth pattern all through the 90s. It wasn't probably until the late 2000s that the number of internet websites actually started to kind of level off a little bit. But the growth rate was still fairly high, just probably not at 100% growth every year. So that is just a good guesstimate as best we can probably do on an unscaled graph. Now, let's look at part D. It says use the graph to estimate the year when there were roughly 30 million host sites. And so what we're going to have to do is work backwards on the graph here. And so we know 30 million host sites or websites is about right here. So we're going to just take that over, and it hits somewhere in there for 30 million host sites. And you can see that I've probably done this fairly poorly as far as scaling out my graph, but we know it's not going to be 5 years completely because 5 years got us to 42 million. So we can say, you know, that it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 5 years. if you wanted to just say 4.5 years, that would be an okay approximation as well. Now it says what year, so we want to know specifically what year that would be. And so if year 0 was 1993, and we added 4 years to that, we're talking about 1997. So we probably hit 30 million websites somewhere in 1997, probably closer to the end of 1997 than the beginning, based off of our estimation from the graph, but it probably happened somewhere in 1997. So that is a look at all of the different types of questions and parts that we could ask you using this new growth model. Very important that you learn that, to memorize y equals a times 1 plus r to the t power. Alright, and that concludes our lesson on the growth model. And we'll look at this in more detail in the next video again.